I was standing on my own front porch with a bag of warm cinnamon rolls, listening to the ocean the way I've listened to it for 30 years off that same gravel driveway. It was an ordinary Saturday morning, until it wasn't. There were voices inside, not mine, not any voice I recognized, and under them, a stranger's child laughing, though my own grandchildren hadn't set foot in that cottage in over a year. 3 weeks earlier, on the phone, I'd mentioned a wine stain soaked into the cushion of my late husband's porch swing. My daughter-in-law, Simone, had laughed, a short, tired laugh, and said, "It's not like you were using it every week, Beverly. It's a house, not a shrine," whose name was actually on the title of that cottage. Why my son went quiet every single time I brought it up, and what not using it every week was supposed to mean, when the last 3 times I'd asked to visit, I'd been told the septic line, or a contractor, or a washed-out road, none of which, I'd later learn, was true. I want you to know, before I tell you anything else, that by the time I stood on that porch, hearing a stranger's child laugh through my own screen door, I already suspected what I was about to find. I just hadn't let myself be sure yet. And wherever you're listening to this tonight, in a car, in a parking lot on your break, in a kitchen after everyone else has gone to bed, in a bed you're supposed to already be asleep in, I'd like to know. Tell me in the comments what state or what country you're listening from tonight. I read every single one, and I think it helps, somehow, knowing this isn't just my kitchen table this story is sitting on. 30 years as a guidance counselor at the same high school in Astoria, Oregon, is a particular kind of education in its own right. 30 years of 16-year-olds explaining themselves teaches a person, in this case me, Beverly Ainsworth, 66 now and 3 years retired, to hear the shape of an excuse before I've finished hearing the sentence. My husband, Douglas, was a marine electrician, the kind of man who could rewire a boat's entire panel and then come home and burn toast, and for 40 years he loved exactly 2 things without complication: me, and a half-acre of scrub pine and dune grass 40 miles down the coast in a town called Manzanita. We bought that lot the year we married, when neither of us had $200 to spare, let alone the price of coastal land, because Douglas's uncle owed him a favor and settled it in real estate instead of cash. For the first 11 years, it was nothing but a platform and a dream, and a tarp we'd sleep under some summer weekends. And then, slowly, board by board, on weekends and vacations, and one long, glorious month when Douglas was between boats, it became a cottage. He built the porch swing himself out of fur he'd salvaged from a torn-down cannery, sanding every board by hand because he didn't trust a rented sander not to gouge the grain. I sewed the curtains on a machine that lived in our actual living room for 2 winters straight, and Douglas used to tease that our own house had gone half-furnished so the cottage could be finished properly. There is a low shelf by the window that still holds a row of sea glass, most of it collected by Preston as a boy, sorted by color the way only a child sorts things, green and brown in one jar, and the rare blue pieces kept separate in a jelly jar with a chipped lid. There is a beam over the kitchen doorway with our heights marked in pencil, Preston's climbing an inch or 2 every summer until the year he simply stopped growing and started, instead, driving himself down from Portland with his own key. Douglas used to say the cottage was the only thing he ever built that improved with age instead of needing constant repair, and I used to tell him that was because he built it slowly enough to get it right the first time, unlike the rest of his projects. We would have been married 44 years this coming October. Douglas has been gone 4 years now, his heart simply stopping one gray morning while he sat in that same porch swing with his coffee, which is either the cruelest place for a man to die or the kindest, and some days I believe both at once. Our son, Preston, is 39, an insurance adjuster in Portland, careful and a little conflict-averse in the specific way of a boy raised by 2 people who almost never raise their voices at each other. He married Simone 7 years ago. She is 36, sharp, capable, the kind of woman who reorganizes a pantry within an hour of walking into someone else's kitchen, and for a long time I mistook that competence for closeness. They have 2 children, Ren, who is 8, and Milo, who is 5, and until 18 months ago, the 4 of them came to the cottage nearly every summer, and I loved watching Ren learn to crab off the same dock her father had learned on. 18 months ago, Simone asked if she and Preston could use the cottage a little more this year, since Preston had started working some remote weeks, and they thought the ocean air would be good for the kids. I said of course. I would have said yes to almost anything that kept that place full of the sound of children, and I remember feeling, if anything, grateful, because for the 2 years after Douglas died, I had barely been able to sleep a full night out there myself, and it comforted me to think of small feet on that porch again, even when mine weren't among them. What I did not know, what I would not learn for over a year, was that within 6 weeks of that conversation, Simone had photographed every room in that cottage: the sea glass shelf, the pencil marks over the doorway, Douglas's porch swing staged with a folded quilt that wasn't ours, and written a listing describing it as a charming coastal retreat, fully renovated, hosted by Simone V., and begun accepting paying guests through a vacation rental platform on weeks I had specifically been told were unavailable to me because of, depending on the month, mold remediation, a septic inspection, or simply Preston wanting some quiet. The first small thing I noticed, and dismissed, was the spare key. I had always kept one extra under a flower pot by the back steps, the way people do in small towns where nobody bothers locking anything, and one visit I found it gone, and Simone told me she'd mailed it to the cleaning service we finally hired, which struck me as thoughtful at the time. I even thanked her for thinking of it. The second thing was the towels. New matching sets, coastal blue, folded in thirds the way I have never once folded a towel in my life, appeared in the linen closet on a visit where I hadn't been the one to buy them, and nobody claimed responsibility for buying them either. When I asked, Simone said something vague about a sale at a linen outlet near their house, and I let it go, because who interrogates their daughter-in-law over towels? The third thing was a locked cabinet under the kitchen sink where the fuse box access used to be, a small brass padlock I didn't own the key to, which Simone explained as just for the cleaning supplies so Milo doesn't get into them, a reasonable-sounding answer that I did not think to question until much later, when I learned that cabinet was where the platform's welcome binder was kept, laminated instructions for the water heater and the Wi-Fi password, meant for guests who were never supposed to exist. The fourth thing was simpler and should have told me everything on its own. Every single time I proposed a weekend at the cottage, something had just gone wrong there. A pipe, a contractor, a washed-out access road that when I drove past it out of simple curiosity one Tuesday, on my way back from a dentist appointment in Nehalem, was perfectly intact, dry, and unremarkable. Once, when I pushed and said I'd come regardless of the supposed plumbing issue, Simone told me, with a laugh I now recognize as rehearsed, "Beverly, honestly, you'd think that cottage was the only thing keeping you busy." And the fifth thing, the one that finally made the shape of it visible, even though I still couldn't see the whole picture, was the wine stain and the sentence that came after it, the one about shrines, which I have not been able to fully stop hearing since. So on what would have been Douglas's and my 44th anniversary, in October, I decided I was done asking permission to visit my own cottage. I didn't call ahead. I bought cinnamon rolls from the bakery Douglas used to love in Cannon Beach, and I drove the coast highway with the window cracked, and I turned onto that gravel driveway, expecting silence and salt air and a porch swing that had been, at the very least, cleaned since the last time I'd complained about it. Instead, there was a family of 5 standing in my living room, a mother and a father, and 3 children, the youngest, maybe Milo's age, already barefoot on my braided rug with a juice box, and the mother was holding a printed confirmation sheet with a photograph of a smiling coastal cottage on it, my kitchen, my porch swing, my sea glass shelf, photographed at some angle that made it look larger and, somehow, less lived in than it actually was, and a phone number that, when I asked to see it, was Simone's. Her name was listed as the host, spelled correctly, with a small circular photo of her smiling beside it. There was a lockbox screwed into the doorframe beside my own front door, the kind that holds a key behind a numeric code, matte black, drilled directly into trim Douglas had cut and fitted himself, and none of these 5 strangers understood, at first, why a woman standing on the porch with a paper sack of cinnamon rolls had gone completely silent and pale. The father actually apologized to me, which still strikes me as backwards every time I think of it, a stranger apologizing for standing in a house he had every reasonable belief he'd paid for. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories usually go, and this isn't one of the ones where I made a scene in front of somebody's children. I apologized to the family for the confusion, which was not my confusion to apologize for, and I helped the mother look up the platform's cancellation policy on her phone so she wouldn't be out the money, and then I sat on the front steps of my own cottage, next to a stranger's minivan, and I called my neighbor across the cove, a retired schoolteacher named Carol Jessup, who has lived on that inlet longer than I have. I told Carol what had just happened, and there was a pause on the line I didn't like the shape of, and then Carol said, "Beverly, I think I've seen your cottage on one of those apps. My daughter was pricing a trip for spring break, and she sent me a listing to laugh about, said the porch swing looked just like yours, and I told her plenty of porches look alike." She sent me the link while we were still on the phone. It was my cottage, every room, the porch swing Douglas built with his own hands, staged with a throw pillow I did not own. The listing had been live, according to the platform's own posted history, for 14 months. There was a review from a family in July, calling it a wonderfully managed little gem. The Ainsworth family clearly takes great care of this place, and I sat there on my own front steps, reading a stranger's compliment about a family I did not recognize, managing a house I had spent 4 decades of my life inside of. I am not, by nature, a woman who confronts people in doorways. 30 years in a guidance office taught me that the loudest reaction rarely produces the truest information, so I did not call Simone that afternoon. Instead, I asked the family, gently, if they would forward me a copy of their booking confirmation, and they did, out of what I think was simple decency toward a stranger who was clearly having the worst afternoon of her month. I drove home to Astoria with that confirmation on the passenger seat where the cinnamon rolls had been, and that night I sat at my kitchen table with Douglas's old laptop, and I did something I had never once done in 4 decades of marriage and 4 years of widowhood. I logged into that platform's help center and requested, as the property's actual legal owner, a full booking and payout history. It took 6 days to arrive, and when it did, I printed all 41 pages and laid them across the kitchen table the way Douglas used to lay out wiring diagrams, and I went through them line by line with a yellow legal pad, the way I once went through a student's attendance record, looking for the pattern underneath the excuses. I made 3 columns, date, amount, and whichever excuse I'd been given for that same week, cross-referenced against my own calendar where I'd written things like cottage, Preston said pipes, and cottage, septic guy. Every single excuse I'd been fed for 14 months, lined up, almost to the day, with a paid reservation. 14 months, 31 separate bookings, ranging from a single weekend in the off-season to a full 9-day stretch over a spring school break that I distinctly remembered being told the cottage was closed for winterizing. $47,200 collected, paid out in bi-weekly deposits to an account registered under the name Simone Voss, which is Simone's maiden name, a name I don't believe Preston even knew she still banked under, and a name that meant every deposit arrived somewhere he would never think to look even if he had thought to look at all. There were 14 guest reviews. I read every one of them that night at my kitchen table, and the review Carol's daughter had nearly booked from was not even the kindest, One guest, in June, had written a full paragraph about how the current caretaker, Simone, was so responsive and clearly loves this property, and I sat with that word, caretaker, for a long time, turning it over like a stone with a sharp edge I hadn't found yet. I called Preston the next morning, not to accuse him, to ask him, calmly, whether he knew his wife had been renting out his father's cottage to strangers for over a year. There was a silence on the line, long enough that I had my answer before he ever spoke, and when he did speak, he said, "I knew she'd listed it a couple times. I didn't know it was. I didn't ask how often. I asked him, gently, why not? And he was quiet again, and then he said something I think he regretted the moment it left his mouth. Because every time I brought it up, it turned into a fight about money, and it was easier to just let her handle it. Not because he approved of what she was doing, because it was easier not to ask. I asked him one more question, the only one that actually mattered to me. Did he know the account the money was going into wasn't even a joint account, wasn't even under her married name? He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice had changed, gone flatter, and he said, "No, I didn't know that part." I believed him. I still believe him, but not knowing had cost him something too, and I told him so. I did not shout at my son. I told him I loved him, and that I needed him to understand something clearly. This was no longer a conversation about towels, or keys, or a wine stain. This was $47,000 of income generated from property I owned, collected under a name that wasn't even the one he'd married, without my knowledge or consent, for over a year, and then I told him what I intended to do about it, so that when it happened, it would not feel to him like an ambush. I have never believed in doing to my family what was done to me. The next week I drove into Portland and sat across a desk from an attorney named Miles Okafor, who specializes in coastal property and family trusts, and who had, coincidentally, handled the paperwork years earlier when Douglas and I first cleared title on that lot. I told him everything, the towels and the padlock and the washed-out road that wasn't washed out at all, and I laid the 41 pages and my own 3-column legal pad on his desk, the same way I'd laid them on my own kitchen table. He asked me one question that I have turned over in my mind since. Did I want to punish Simone, or did I want to protect the cottage? I told him I wanted both, but if I could only have one, I wanted the second. He explained that because the title had only ever been in my name, and Douglas's before that, Simone had never had any legal standing to list the property at all, which meant the platform would very likely honor a removal request from me directly, without needing a court order first. He also explained the difference, patiently, the way a person explains something to someone who has spent her whole life reading other people's paperwork instead of her own, between a revocable trust, which I could unwind later if I changed my mind, and an irrevocable one, which I could not. He recommended I sleep on that decision for at least a week before signing anything. I did. It didn't change my answer. So here is what I did. In the space of 11 days, I deactivated the rental listing myself, using my ownership documentation, which the platform honored within 48 hours, once they confirmed Simone was not the titled owner. I had the locks changed and the lockbox removed, and I donated the coastal blue towels to the church thrift shop in Manzanita, which felt, at the time, like an unreasonably satisfying errand. And with Mr. Okafor's help, I placed the cottage into an irrevocable trust, naming my granddaughter Wren as the sole beneficiary, with the property to be held and maintained until she turns 25, administered by a neutral trustee, a small local bank's trust department, not a family member, with explicit language barring any rental use by anyone outside our immediate family without written consent from that trustee. Mr. Okafor also drafted a separate repayment agreement for the $47,200, structured as an initial payment followed by monthly installments over the following 2 years, secured against nothing but Simone's signature, and, I'll admit, my own stubborn faith that a signed document means something even when a person's word apparently doesn't. Once the trust was signed and recorded, it could not be undone by me, by Preston, or by anyone who marries into this family after me. That was the entire point. I called Simone myself to tell her, the same afternoon the paperwork was filed. I did not enjoy the call, and I want to say that plainly, because there is a way people tell these stories where the telling itself sounds like triumph, and that was not what this felt like. I told her the cottage now belonged, permanently and irreversibly, to her daughter, and that any income she had already collected would need to be discussed separately through Mr. Okafor's office as a matter of repayment. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You didn't even ask me why," and I told her I hadn't needed to, because the 41 pages had already answered that question for both of us. Thanksgiving came 5 weeks after the trust was recorded, and I almost didn't host it that year, but Carol talked me into it, and the whole family gathered at my house in Astoria, Preston and Simone and the children, a couple of Douglas's old co-workers from the marina, a few old neighbors who'd been coming for years. Simone was civil, careful, the way a person is careful around a stove she's been burned on before. It was Preston, not me, who brought it up at the table, in front of everyone, when one of Douglas's old co-workers asked in passing how the cottage was doing these days. Preston said, plainly, "It's Wren's now. Grandma set it up so nobody can ever take it away from her or rent it out from under her." He looked at Wren when he said it, not at Simone, and Wren, who is 8 and understands more than anyone gives her credit for, asked if that meant she was rich, and the whole table laughed, and something in the room loosened that had been tight for months. Simone didn't say anything, but she didn't leave the table either, and I have learned to count that as its own small kind of progress. 3 weeks after that, Preston drove out to Astoria alone, without Simone, and sat at my kitchen table, and told me that he and Simone were seeing a counselor, and that he'd moved the joint accounts into something he could actually see clearly for the first time in years. He didn't defend her. He didn't ask me to undo anything. He asked, quietly, if he could still bring the kids to the cottage some weekends, now that it belonged to Wren, in every way that mattered, and I told him that door had never once been closed to him. Simone has not called since, beyond one email through Mr. Okafor's office confirming the first repayment installment, $12,000 against the 47, arriving on schedule. I don't know if the rest will come as easily. I have stopped expecting it to arrive out of remorse and started expecting it to arrive out of the plain, unglamorous mechanics of a signed agreement, which is, I have come to believe, a far more reliable engine than anyone's feelings. 6 months after that October morning, I drove the coast highway again, alone, with a paper sack of cinnamon rolls on the passenger seat, the same bakery, the same road, and I turned onto that gravel driveway and heard, instead of a stranger's laughter, nothing at all, just the low, steady sound of the ocean past the dune, and the porch swing creaking faintly in the wind, empty, waiting, exactly the way Douglas left it. I sat on the front steps and ate a cinnamon roll by myself, and did not feel lonely, which surprised me. Wren turns 25 in 17 years. I intend to be there for the anniversary the trust actually marks, however old that makes me, and I have already told her, in the plain way a person tells an 8-year-old something enormous, that the cottage will be hers, and that it is not a house to be rented to strangers or handed off quietly to whoever manages to get their name on a listing first. It is a place her grandfather built with his own hands out of cannery wood, one board at a time, and some things, once a person understands what they actually cost somebody to build, she does not get to borrow without asking. I think about that phrase often now. It's not like you were using it, as though a house only counts as real while somebody's eyes are on it. I have come to believe the opposite. A house built with 2 hands, one board at a time, over 11 quiet years, is never empty, even when nobody's watching, especially then.